Everyone thinks NVIDIA's biggest threat is AMD or another AI chip company. It isn't. The company that could eventually break NVIDIA's dominance isn't trying to build a better GPU at all. It's building a completely different way to solve the problems GPUs were invented for. And over the past 2 years, a series of breakthroughs quietly removed several of the biggest reasons experts believed that future was still decades away. Today we're connecting those breakthroughs and why they could change NVIDIA's future much sooner than most investors realize. For the past few years, one company has stood at the center of the artificial intelligence revolution: NVIDIA. Every breakthrough seemed to strengthen its position. Whether it was ChatGPT, image generation, autonomous vehicles, or the race to build ever larger AI models, the answer was almost always the same: more NVIDIA GPUs. That demand transformed the company into one of the most valuable businesses in history, and many investors now assume that trend will continue for the rest of the decade. On the surface, that assumption makes perfect sense. AI models are becoming larger, data centers are expanding at record speed, and every major technology company is spending billions on new computing infrastructure. If AI keeps growing, GPU demand should grow with it, but that logic depends on one critical assumption. It assumes the next era of computing will solve problems in the same way today's systems do. Over the past 2 years, several breakthroughs in quantum computing have started challenging that assumption. Some received global headlines. Others barely made the news before disappearing from the conversation. Taken together, they suggest something much more significant than another leap in processing power. The biggest threat to NVIDIA may have nothing to do with a competitor building a faster AI chip, because quantum computing doesn't need to outperform NVIDIA's GPUs to change the industry's direction. It only needs to make today's way of solving computational problems less important. And once that possibility enters the picture, NVIDIA's future starts looking far less certain than most people realize. When most people think about NVIDIA's dominance, they picture rows of powerful GPUs filling massive AI data centers. Those chips deserve the attention they get. They train the world's most advanced language models, generate realistic images and videos, and power countless AI applications. But the hardware tells only part of the story. The real advantage NVIDIA built over the past 2 decades lives in software, specifically a platform called CUDA. CUDA is the programming framework developers use to unlock the full performance of NVIDIA's GPUs. More than 4 million developers have learned it. Universities teach it. AI startups build around it. Enterprise software depends on it. Thousands of research papers and machine learning libraries have been optimized specifically for CUDA. Once an organization builds its infrastructure around that ecosystem, changing platforms becomes expensive, time-consuming, and risky. That creates an enormous competitive advantage. A rival company doesn't just have to produce a faster chip. It also has to convince millions of developers and thousands of businesses to rewrite years of software, retrain engineering teams, and accept the costs that come with rebuilding their entire AI stack. That kind of ecosystem is incredibly difficult to replace. But it can become less relevant if the foundation beneath it changes. Now consider what quantum computing is trying to achieve. Instead of improving the existing GPU model, quantum researchers are designing entirely new computing architectures with their own programming languages, development tools, and optimization methods. As those systems mature, developers may never need to enter the CUDA ecosystem in the first place. They could build directly for quantum hardware, creating software that was never designed around GPUs. That changes the competitive landscape completely. NVIDIA's greatest strength has never been the silicon inside its chips. It has been the community, software, and expertise built around those chips. If the next generation of developers begins building for a different architecture from day one, that advantage becomes much harder to protect. And that may be the first place where quantum computing challenges NVIDIA, not by defeating its hardware, but by growing an ecosystem that develops beyond CUDA's reach. To understand why quantum computing could eventually threaten NVIDIA, you first have to understand what NVIDIA actually accelerates. Every modern AI model, no matter how advanced it appears, spends most of its time doing mathematics. When an AI learns from billions of examples, it constantly adjusts numerical values called weights. Those adjustments happen through massive matrix multiplications, vector calculations, and optimization routines repeated trillions of times. Picture enormous grids of numbers interacting with other grids of numbers over and over again until the model gradually becomes better at recognizing patterns. That workload is exactly what NVIDIA's GPUs were designed to do faster than anyone else. For years, that has made GPUs the engine behind the AI revolution. But researchers working on quantum computing have been approaching the same challenge from a completely different direction. One algorithm deserves far more attention than it receives: the Haro-Hasidim-Lloyd algorithm, better known as HHL. It rarely appears in mainstream discussions because it isn't attached to a flashy piece of hardware. There are no benchmark charts or product launches built around it. Yet, HHL is important because it focuses on one of the most fundamental problems in computing: solving certain systems of linear equations, the mathematical backbone behind many optimization and machine learning tasks. Under the right conditions, a large-scale fault-tolerant quantum computer could use HHL to solve some of those problems dramatically more efficiently than classical methods. Researchers continue to debate exactly where those advantages will become practical. But the direction of the research is difficult to ignore. That is why this algorithm matters to NVIDIA. The company's hardware dominates because it performs linear algebra at extraordinary speed. HHL explores a different route to tackling parts of that same mathematical workload. If future quantum systems can handle those calculations more effectively for real-world applications, developers may choose an entirely different computational path instead of simply buying larger GPU clusters. That shifts the conversation beyond hardware. The long-term competition isn't defined by one chip outperforming another. It's shaped by algorithms that favor a completely different computing architecture. If one announcement changed how researchers talk about quantum computing, it wasn't the benchmark most people remember. When Google introduced its Willow quantum processor, nearly every headline focused on speed. News outlets compared it with classical supercomputers, highlighted impossible calculations, and celebrated another milestone in the quantum race. Those stories missed the detail that many researchers found even more important. Willow demonstrated progress toward what's known as below-threshold error correction. That phrase sounds technical, but the underlying idea is surprisingly simple. Quantum computers are incredibly sensitive. Tiny disturbances from heat, vibration, or electromagnetic noise can introduce errors into calculations. For decades, that problem stood in the way of building practical quantum machines. As engineers added more qubits, they also created more opportunities for mistakes. Scaling a quantum computer often meant making it less reliable. Below-threshold error correction points toward a different future. Once error rates fall below a critical threshold, adding more error-correcting qubits can reduce the overall number of mistakes instead of increasing them. Reaching that region doesn't solve every engineering challenge, but it marks an important step because larger systems become more realistic rather than more fragile. That matters because error correction has long been one of the strongest arguments against near-term quantum computing. Around the time of CES 2025, Jensen Huang publicly suggested that truly useful quantum computers remained many years away. His comments reflected a view shared by much of the industry. Reliable error correction would take a long time to achieve before quantum systems could tackle meaningful commercial workloads. Google's Willow announcement didn't prove that large-scale quantum computers have arrived. It did show measurable progress on one of the hardest engineering problems standing in the way. That changed the conversation. Researchers stopped asking only whether quantum computing could overcome its biggest technical obstacle. Increasingly, the discussion turned toward how quickly the remaining obstacles could be solved. For companies built on today's computing architecture, that shift deserves close attention. Because once the timeline starts moving forward, every long-term assumption built around classical computing has to be examined again. If quantum computing poses such a serious long-term challenge, the obvious question is this: what is NVIDIA doing about it? The answer is something surprisingly few people talk about. It's called CUDA Quantum. Unlike traditional CUDA, which was built to help developers unlock the performance of NVIDIA's GPUs, CUDA Quantum is designed for a very different future. It gives researchers a framework for writing applications that combine classical computers with quantum processors. Instead of treating quantum computers as replacements, It treats them as specialized partners that work alongside conventional hardware. That approach is known as hybrid computing. A classical computer continues handling the tasks it performs best, while selected calculations are sent to a quantum processor whenever doing so offers an advantage. Even many quantum researchers expect this hybrid model to define the industry's early commercial phase, because quantum hardware still depends on classical systems for control, error management, and many supporting calculations. On the surface, CUDA Quantum looks like another product launch. Viewed from a broader perspective, it reveals how NVIDIA sees the future. The company understands that developers are its most valuable asset. Millions of engineers already build software inside the CUDA ecosystem. If those same developers begin experimenting with quantum computing through familiar NVIDIA tools, the company remains part of the conversation regardless of how the hardware evolves. That strategy gives NVIDIA an opportunity to extend its software ecosystem into the quantum era, instead of watching a separate ecosystem emerge alongside it. Because the greatest long-term risk isn't simply losing hardware sales. The greater risk is developers learning new programming models, new software frameworks, and new workflows that never depend on CUDA in the first place. If quantum development begins inside NVIDIA's ecosystem, the company has a pathway into the next generation of computing. If it doesn't, an entirely new community of developers could grow around competing platforms, leaving NVIDIA with far less influence over the future than it enjoys today. So, if you're enjoying deep technology stories that go beyond the headlines, consider subscribing. Every week we break down the breakthroughs that could shape the next decade before they become common knowledge. Now, the software story is only part of the picture. The next challenge reaches into one of NVIDIA's fastest growing businesses, and almost nobody is talking about it. By this point, you might be thinking that all of this comes back to GPUs. But one of NVIDIA's fastest growing businesses has nothing to do with designing AI chips. It's networking. In 2020, NVIDIA completed its acquisition of Mellanox, bringing one of the world's leading high-performance networking companies under its control. That deal gave NVIDIA ownership of InfiniBand, a networking technology built for moving enormous amounts of data between thousands of servers with extremely low latency. Modern AI data centers depend on it. Training a large language model isn't done by a single GPU. It requires thousands of GPUs working together as one enormous system, constantly exchanging information. The faster those processors communicate, the faster the entire cluster can train an AI model. That's why NVIDIA's networking business has become a critical piece of its data center strategy, rather than a supporting product. Now consider where quantum computing could eventually lead. Researchers aren't only trying to build more capable quantum processors, they're also developing quantum networks that use entangled quantum states to exchange quantum information between distant machines. Around the world, universities, national laboratories, and technology companies are experimenting with what many describe as the foundation of a future quantum internet. Those systems remain in the research stage, and they won't replace today's networking infrastructure anytime soon. Even so, they point toward a very different architecture for connecting quantum computers together. As larger quantum systems emerge, they may require networking technologies designed specifically for quantum communication, rather than the classical data transfer methods that power today's AI clusters. That possibility expands the competitive landscape beyond AI accelerators. Even if NVIDIA continues building the world's best GPUs, tomorrow's data centers may gradually incorporate networking technologies built for quantum workloads. If that transition gathers momentum over the next decade, the company won't simply be defending its leadership in AI processors. It could also face an entirely new challenge in one of the infrastructure businesses that helped fuel its explosive growth. If you've followed quantum computing for any length of time, you've probably heard the same prediction repeated over and over again. Practical quantum computers are still 10 to 15 years away. For years, that estimate became the industry's default timeline. It wasn't pulled out of thin air. Researchers understood the enormous engineering challenges involved in building large-scale, fault-tolerant quantum systems. Quantum processors needed more qubits, lower error rates, better control systems, and reliable error correction. Every one of those problems looked like it could take many years to solve. But technology doesn't always move in a straight line. Sometimes progress appears slow for a long time. Then several breakthroughs arrive close together, forcing everyone to reconsider how quickly a field is advancing. That's exactly what's happened in quantum computing. Google's Willow processor demonstrated meaningful progress in quantum error correction, addressing one of the biggest technical obstacles researchers had been trying to overcome for decades. Around the same period, Microsoft revealed new progress toward topological qubits, a design the company believes could eventually produce more stable and scalable quantum computers. The approach still requires significant engineering work, but the announcement showed that multiple paths toward practical quantum hardware continue to move forward. IBM added another piece to the picture with its Condor processor, becoming the first company to publicly introduce a quantum chip containing more than 1,000 superconducting qubits. A larger qubit count alone doesn't make a practical quantum computer, but it demonstrates that manufacturers are steadily learning how to build increasingly complex quantum systems. Viewed individually, each announcement represents progress in a different area. Viewed together, they tell a broader story. One breakthrough improves error correction. Another explores a new hardware architecture. A third demonstrates continued scaling. Those advances reinforce one another, giving researchers more confidence that several of the field's hardest problems are being tackled simultaneously, rather than one after another. That doesn't mean practical quantum computers are arriving next year. No credible researcher can give an exact date. It does mean the conversation has become more nuanced than the simple 10 to 15 years estimate that dominated headlines only a few years ago. For investors, that distinction matters. NVIDIA's business doesn't depend on quantum computers replacing GPUs overnight. It depends on how much time the company has to strengthen its position before a fundamentally different computing architecture begins competing for the workloads that created the AI boom in the first place. When Jensen Huang spoke about quantum computing during CES 2025, one comment dominated the headlines. He suggested that truly useful quantum computers were still many years away. Most people interpreted that as a broad dismissal of the entire field, but the wording mattered. Huang was referring to fault-tolerant universal quantum computers, the kind of machines capable of reliably running almost any quantum algorithm at scale. Building those systems requires millions of physical qubits, sophisticated error correction, and engineering breakthroughs that researchers are still working toward. By that definition, quantum computing still has significant hurdles ahead, but universal quantum computers are only one part of the broader landscape. While researchers continue pursuing that long-term goal, other forms of quantum computing are already finding practical applications. Quantum annealers specialize in optimization problems, searching through enormous numbers of possible solutions to identify efficient outcomes for tasks such as scheduling, logistics, and resource allocation. Variational quantum algorithms combine quantum processors with classical computers, allowing each system to perform the calculations it handles most effectively. These hybrid approaches are widely viewed as one of the most practical ways to extract value from today's quantum hardware, while larger fault-tolerant systems remain under development. That distinction often disappears in public discussions. When people hear quantum computing, they imagine one technology following one timeline. In reality, several different approaches are progressing at the same time, each targeting different kinds of problems. Some of those systems have already moved beyond the laboratory. Companies in industries such as logistics, manufacturing, finance, and drug discovery are experimenting with or deploying specialized quantum solutions where they offer measurable advantages for particular workloads. Those deployments remain narrow, but they demonstrate that commercial adoption has already begun in selected areas. That changes the competitive picture. NVIDIA doesn't need to wait for fully universal quantum computers before encountering new forms of competition. As specialized quantum systems continue solving specific industrial problems, they begin attracting developers, enterprise customers, and research investment long before the ultimate version of quantum computing arrives. And history shows that technological transitions often begin that way, one specialized workload at a time, until the broader market starts paying attention. One reason NVIDIA became one of the world's most valuable companies is that its business expanded far beyond gaming. The AI boom opened the door to entirely new industries. Pharmaceutical companies began using GPU clusters to simulate molecular interactions and accelerate drug discovery. Logistics companies relied on massive computing systems to optimize supply chains, delivery routes, and warehouse operations. Financial institutions searched for better portfolio optimization and risk analysis. Defense contractors invested heavily in AI infrastructure for simulation, planning, and intelligence systems. These enterprise markets became some of NVIDIA's fastest-growing sources of revenue. Now, a different technology is beginning to compete for some of those same workloads. Companies such as D-Wave have spent years developing quantum systems designed specifically for optimization problems. Several organizations have already used those systems to explore traffic management, manufacturing schedules, and supply chain planning. The goal isn't to replace every classical computer. It's to solve particular optimization challenges where quantum methods may offer an advantage. The same pattern is emerging in pharmaceuticals. Companies including Zapata Computing and qubit have worked with pharmaceutical and industrial partners to investigate how quantum algorithms could improve molecular simulation and materials research. Many of these projects remain collaborative research efforts rather than large-scale replacements for GPU infrastructure, but they represent a growing investment in quantum-first workflows. The defense sector is watching just as closely. Governments have historically identified important computing technologies long before they become mainstream. Through initiatives such as DARPA's Quantum Benchmarking Initiative, researchers are evaluating which military computing tasks could eventually benefit from quantum systems and how those systems should be measured against classical alternatives. None of these developments suggest that enterprises are abandoning NVIDIA today, but market transitions rarely begin with dramatic announcements. A company doesn't hold a press conference to say it will buy slightly fewer GPU servers over the next procurement cycle. It starts experimenting with a different tool. If those experiments deliver better results for even a handful of specialized workloads, budgets gradually shift, engineering teams build new expertise, and investment follows. By the time the broader market recognizes the trend, the transition is often already well underway. That is the possibility NVIDIA and every long-term investor is now being forced to consider. When you step back and connect all of these pieces, a much bigger picture begins to emerge. CUDA gave NVIDIA far more than powerful hardware. It created one of the largest developer ecosystems in modern computing. Algorithms such as HHL suggest that some of the mathematical problems behind artificial intelligence could eventually be approached in fundamentally different ways. Google's Willow processor demonstrated progress on quantum error correction, reducing uncertainty around one of the field's biggest technical obstacles. NVIDIA responded by introducing CUDA Quantum, positioning its software ecosystem for a future where classical and quantum computers work together. At the same time, quantum networking research is exploring new ways to connect future computing systems. Enterprise customers are investing in specialized quantum applications. Defense organizations are evaluating where quantum hardware could outperform classical machines. And a series of breakthroughs has made the industry's timeline feel less predictable than it did only a few years ago. None of those developments prove that NVIDIA is about to lose its leadership. They do raise a much more important question. What happens if GPUs remain extraordinary at exactly the tasks they were designed to perform, while researchers gradually solve more valuable problems using computational methods that GPUs were never designed to handle? History has seen transitions like this before. Kodak produced some of the best photographic film in the world. Its products didn't suddenly become inferior. Consumer demand shifted toward digital photography because it offered capabilities that film could never provide, regardless of quality. Quantum computing could represent a similar kind of shift. Its long-term impact may come from expanding the kinds of computational problems scientists and engineers choose to solve, rather than replacing every GPU inside today's data centers. If that future unfolds, NVIDIA's greatest challenge won't come from another company building a faster graphics processor. It will come from a new computing paradigm, changing what the industry values most. And that is why the future of quantum computing matters so much. The question is no longer whether NVIDIA builds remarkable hardware. The question is whether the next era of computing will reward the same strengths that made NVIDIA one of the most valuable companies in history.